Officer Blake Rodriguez had been patrolling the quiet streets of Riverside Heights for 3 years. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing much happened after dark. Tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and houses that cost more than most people made in 5 years. Blake liked working this beat because it was predictable and safe. On this particular Tuesday evening, the sun was setting behind the maple trees that gave Maple Street its name. Blake was driving slowly, his patrol car windows down, enjoying the cool breeze. He was thinking about his dinner plans when something caught his eye. A tall black man was walking down the sidewalk, carrying what looked like a baseball bat. The man wore jeans, a gray hoodie, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He moved with purpose, like he had somewhere important to be. Blake's training kicked in immediately, but not the good kind. 3 years on the force had taught him to see threats everywhere, especially in places where they didn't belong, and in Blake's mind, this man didn't belong in Riverside Heights. Blake pulled his patrol car to the curb and watched. The man continued walking toward the community park at the end of the street. Blake reached for his radio. Unit 247 to dispatch. I've got a suspicious individual on Maple Street carrying what appears to be a weapon. Requesting backup. The dispatcher's voice crackled back. Copy that, 247. Backup is en route. What's your exact location? Corner of Maple and Oak, heading toward Riverside Park. Blake stepped out of his car, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. Subject is a black male, approximately 6 feet tall, carrying a baseball bat. Blake's heart started beating faster as he approached. The man, whose name was actually Captain David Washington, had stopped near the park entrance. He was checking his phone and seemed completely unaware that he was being watched. "Hey!" Blake shouted, his voice echoing down the quiet street. "Stop right there!" David looked up, confused. He had been checking a text message from his daughter, telling him she was already at the field with her teammates. Her Little League team had practice every Tuesday and Thursday, and David never missed coaching when he could help it. "Excuse me?" David said, lowering his phone. Blake was now about 20 feet away, his hand still resting on his gun. "I said stop. Put down whatever you're carrying and put your hands where I can see them." David looked down at the aluminum bat in his other hand. It was his daughter's practice bat, nothing special. Pink grip tape that she had wrapped around the handle herself. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," David said calmly. He had dealt with situations like this before, unfortunately. "I'm here to coach my daughter's baseball team. Practice starts in 10 minutes. Blake didn't believe him for a second. The man's calm demeanor only made him more suspicious. In Blake's experience, innocent people were nervous when confronted by police. This guy was too collected, too confident. "Sure you are," Blake said sarcastically. "And I'm the Easter Bunny. Drop the bat and get on the ground." "Now," David remained standing. "Officer, my name is David Washington. My daughter plays for the Riverside Rangers. If you look in the park, you'll see a bunch of 8-year-old girls warming up. I'm their coach." Blake's voice got louder. "I don't care what story you've made up. You don't belong in this neighborhood and you're carrying a weapon. Drop it now." The commotion was starting to draw attention. Mrs. Chen, who lived in the house across from the park, came out to water her garden and stayed to watch. Mr. Thompson, walking his golden retriever, stopped and pulled out his phone. David knew the situation was escalating dangerously. He had seen too many incidents go wrong too quickly. With deliberate movements, he slowly placed the bat on the ground. "There," David said, raising his hands. "The bat is down. But officer, you're making a serious mistake here." Blake felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, the guy was cooperating. "That's what they all say. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. And Dad," a young voice called from the park. "Dad, where are you?" "Coach Taylor wants to know if we're doing batting practice today." David's 8-year-old daughter, Lily, came running toward the park entrance. She was wearing her purple and yellow Riverside Rangers uniform, her ponytail bouncing as she ran. When she saw her father with his hands up and a police officer pointing at him, she stopped short. "What's happening?" Lily asked, her voice small and scared. Blake looked at the little girl, then back at David. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind. But he had come too far to back down now. "Get back to the field, sweetheart," David said gently to his daughter. "Tell Coach Taylor I'll be there in just a minute. Officer Rodriguez and I are just having a conversation." Blake was surprised the man knew his name, but then he remembered his name tag. Still, something about the way the man said it made him uncomfortable. "You need to leave," Blake told Lily. "This is police business." 2 more patrol cars pulled up, their lights flashing but sirens off. Officers Kim Patterson and Troy Williams got out of their vehicles and approached the scene. "What do we have here, Blake?" Officer Patterson asked. "Suspicious individual with a weapon," Blake replied. "Claims he's here to coach kids baseball, but look at him. Does he look like he belongs in this neighborhood?" Officer Williams looked at David, who was still standing with his hands raised. Something seemed familiar about the man's face, but Williams couldn't quite place it. "Sir, can you provide some identification?" Williams asked, his tone much calmer than Blake's had been. "My wallet is in my back pocket," David replied. "May I reach for it?" Williams nodded. David slowly retrieved his wallet and handed over his driver's license and another card. Patterson looked at the ID and her face went pale. She whispered something to Williams, who also looked shocked. "Blake," Patterson said quietly, "we need to talk," but Blake was too worked up to listen. A small crowd had gathered now. Some parents arriving for practice, a few neighbors, and several people with phones recording the entire incident. "I don't care who he claims to be," Blake said loudly. "He was walking through a nice neighborhood carrying a weapon. I did my job." Williams walked over to Blake and spoke in his ear. Whatever he said made Blake's face change completely. The color drained from his cheeks, and for the first time he looked uncertain. David put his hands down and picked up his daughter's bat. "Officers, I appreciate your colleagues' recognition of the situation. Officer Rodriguez, I believe, will be speaking again very soon." Patterson and Williams both looked like they wanted to disappear. They knew Blake had just made the biggest mistake of his career. As David walked toward the baseball field where his daughter was waiting, Blake stood frozen on the sidewalk. The crowd slowly dispersed, but not before several people had captured the entire confrontation on video. Blake had no idea that in less than 12 hours, his whole world was about to change forever. Blake Rodriguez walked into the Riverside Police Department the next morning, feeling uneasy. He had barely slept, replaying the events from the night before. The way officers Patterson and Williams had looked at him kept bothering him, and the way that man, David Washington, had said they would be speaking again soon. Blake tried to shake off the feeling as he grabbed his coffee from the break room. Officer Danny Torres was already there, stirring sugar into his cup. "Morning, Blake," Danny said. "Heard you had some excitement last night." "Just doing my job," Blake replied, though he sounded less confident than usual. "Guy with a weapon in a nice neighborhood. You know how it is." Danny gave him a strange look but didn't say anything. Blake noticed that several other officers seemed to be avoiding eye contact with him as he walked to his desk. Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez stood at the front of the briefing room, looking more serious than usual. She was holding a folder and checking her watch repeatedly. "All right, everyone, take your seats," she called out. "We have some important announcements this morning." Blake settled into his usual spot in the third row, next to Danny. The room buzzed with quiet conversation until Martinez raised her hand for silence. "As you all know, Captain Johnson retired last Friday after 30 years of service," Martinez began. "Today I'm honored to introduce our new commanding officer." Blake half listened as Martinez talked about the new captain's impressive background. 20 years in law enforcement, decorated veteran, master's degree in criminal justice, and a reputation for community policing excellence. "Please welcome Captain David Washington," Martinez said. The room fell silent as a tall black man in a crisp uniform walked through the door. Blake's coffee cup slipped from his hand and crashed to the floor, sending hot liquid splashing across his shoes. It was him, the same man from last night, the man Blake had confronted, threatened and humiliated in front of a crowd of people, the man who had remained calm while Blake made a fool of himself. Captain Washington stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. The captain's bars on his shoulders caught the fluorescent light. Blake felt sick to his stomach. His mouth went dry and his hands started shaking. Around him, he could hear whispers from other officers who had been at the scene the night before. "Good morning," Captain Washington said, his voice calm and professional. "I'm glad to be here at Riverside PD. I've heard excellent things about this department and the community it serves." Blake wanted to disappear. He wanted to crawl under his desk and hide. Instead, he sat frozen in his chair, watching his new boss speak. "I believe in community policing," Washington continued, "building relationships with the people we serve, treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or what neighborhood they live in." Several officers nodded in agreement. Blake felt like everyone was looking at him, though most weren't. I also believe in accountability, Washington said, and this time Blake was sure the captain's eyes lingered on him for a moment. We are held to a higher standard because of the badge we wear. Our actions reflect not just on ourselves, but on every officer in this department. Lieutenant Martinez looked confused by the tension she could feel in the room, but couldn't quite identify. Captain, Washington comes to us from the Metro City Police Department, where he oversaw community relations, Martinez explained. He's also an expert in conflict resolution and cultural sensitivity training. Blake's heart sank even further. Cultural sensitivity training. The irony wasn't lost on him. I want each of you to know that my door is always open, Washington said. I believe in addressing issues directly and professionally. If anyone has concerns or questions, please don't hesitate to schedule a meeting with me. Blake knew he was in trouble. Big trouble. The question was how much trouble. After the briefing ended, officers slowly filed out of the room. Blake tried to blend in with the crowd, but as he reached the door, he heard his name. Officer Rodriguez, Captain Washington called out. Could I see you in my office in 10 minutes? Blake's legs felt like rubber. Yes, sir, he managed to say. Danny Torres caught up with Blake in the hallway. Dude, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost, Blake couldn't explain. How could he tell Danny that he had just learned their new captain was the man he had racially profiled and threatened less than 24 hours ago? I'm fine, Blake lied. Just tired. But Danny had been a cop long enough to know when someone was lying. Blake, seriously, what happened last night? Patterson and Williams won't talk about it, and you're acting weird. Before Blake could answer, Officer Patterson appeared beside them. Blake, you need to know something, she said quietly. That man from last night? He's been a captain for 5 years. He has commendations for community service, valor, and leadership. He's not just some guy with a baseball bat. Blake felt his world crumbling around him. Why didn't you tell me last night? We tried to, Patterson said. But you weren't listening. You were too busy proving a point that didn't need to be proved. The 10 minutes passed like 10 seconds. Blake found himself standing outside Captain Washington's office, his hand raised to knock on the door. Through the glass, he could see Washington reviewing files at his desk. Blake knocked softly. Come in, Washington said without looking up. Blake entered and stood at attention, though Washington hadn't asked him to. The office was sparse with just a few personal photos on the desk. Blake could see a picture of a little girl in a baseball uniform. The same little girl who had called Washington Dad the night before. Washington finished reading the document in front of him and set it aside. Then he looked up at Blake with the same calm expression he had worn during their confrontation. Please, have a seat, Washington said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Blake sat down, his back rigid with tension. I imagine you're wondering what happens next, Washington said. Blake nodded, not trusting his voice. Washington opened a folder on his desk. Inside were printed photos from cell phone videos taken the night before. Blake could see himself pointing at Washington, see the angry expression on his own face. These were posted on social media last night, Washington explained. The department has already received several complaints. The mayor's office called this morning. Blake closed his eyes. His career was over. He was sure of it. I want you to tell me what you were thinking last night, Washington said. Help me understand your decision-making process. Blake opened his mouth, but no words came out. How could he explain that he had seen a black man in a white neighborhood and assumed the worst? How could he admit that his own prejudices had clouded his judgment? I thought, Blake started, then stopped. I thought you were suspicious. A man with a weapon in a nice neighborhood. What made me suspicious? Washington asked. Was it the weapon? Or was it something else? Blake knew what Washington was getting at, but he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. Officer Rodriguez, I've been in law enforcement for 20 years, Washington said. I've been on both sides of situations like this. I know what you saw when you looked at me last night. The room was quiet except for the humming of the air conditioning. Blake stared at his hands, ashamed to meet his captain's eyes. The question now, Washington continued, is what we do about it. I could file a formal complaint. I could recommend your dismissal. I could make this a very public example of what happens when officers let bias influence their judgment. Blake finally looked up. Are you going to fire me? Washington leaned back in his chair. That depends on you, Officer Rodriguez. Are you willing to acknowledge what really happened last night? And more importantly, Are you willing to do something about it? Blake Rodriguez sat in Captain Washington's office, staring at the folder of photos on the desk between them. His mouth felt dry as sandpaper, and his uniform shirt was damp with sweat despite the air conditioning. I'm waiting for an answer, Officer Rodriguez, Captain Washington said calmly. Are you willing to acknowledge what really happened last night? Blake shifted in his chair. He had been a police officer for 3 years, but he had never felt smaller than he did in this moment. The man sitting across from him had every right to end his career, and they both knew it. I made a mistake, Blake said quietly. What kind of mistake? Washington pressed. Blake looked out the window, watching other officers going about their normal day. He envied them. Their biggest worry was probably what to have for lunch. I profiled you, Blake admitted, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. I saw a black man in a white neighborhood and I assumed you didn't belong there. Washington nodded slowly. And what did that assumption lead you to do? I treated you like a criminal instead of asking questions first, Blake said. I escalated the situation when I should have de-escalated it. For the first time since Blake had entered the office, Washington's expression softened slightly. That's honest. I appreciate that. Blake felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe he wasn't completely doomed. Washington opened another folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. This is a formal complaint filed by Mrs. Chen, who witnessed the incident. She says you used inappropriate language and made assumptions based on race. Blake's heart sank again. He remembered Mrs. Chen, the elderly Asian woman who had been watering her garden. She had watched the whole thing. Mr. Thompson also filed a complaint, Washington continued, showing Blake another document. He recorded most of the incident on his phone. Would you like to see the video? Blake shook his head quickly. No, sir. I believe you. Washington set the papers aside and leaned forward. Blake, I'm going to be straight with you. You made a serious error in judgment last night, the kind that can destroy careers and communities' trust in law enforcement. Blake nodded miserably. But, Washington continued, I believe people can change. I believe in second chances when they're earned. Blake looked up hopefully. I'm going to give you a choice, Washington said. Option 1, I process these complaints through official channels. There will be an investigation, media attention, and likely your dismissal from the force. Your name will be attached to this incident forever. Blake's stomach churned. Option 2, Washington said. You take responsibility for your actions and commit to real change. But it won't be easy and it won't be comfortable. What would I have to do? Blake asked. Washington pulled out a thick packet of papers. Cultural sensitivity training twice a week for 6 months. Community service in the neighborhoods you patrol, especially areas with diverse populations. You'll attend workshops on implicit bias and cultural awareness. Blake looked at the packet. It was thick enough to be a book. You'll also be assigned to work directly with community leaders, Washington continued, learning about the people you've sworn to protect and serve. All of this will be on your own time, not department time. Blake flipped through the pages. There were schedules, reading assignments, and contact information for various community organizations. There's more, Washington said. You'll write a formal letter of apology to be read at the next community meeting. You'll also participate in a ride-along program with officers who specialize in community policing. Blake felt overwhelmed. This is a lot. Change is hard work, Washington replied. If you're not willing to put in the effort, I'll understand. We can go with option 1 instead. Blake thought about his family. His girlfriend Lisa, who worked as a teacher and believed in second chances. His younger brother who looked up to him. His parents who had been so proud when he graduated from the police academy. I'll do it, Blake said. Option 2. Washington nodded and pushed the packet across the desk. Read through everything tonight. We start Monday morning. Blake picked up the papers. Captain, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why are you giving me a second chance? After what I did to you, you could have ruined my career. Washington was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Blake, I've been where you are. Not exactly, but close enough. Early in my career, I made assumptions about people too. Different assumptions than yours, but assumptions nonetheless. Blake was surprised. Captain Washington seemed so composed, so professional. It was hard to imagine him making mistakes. I had a captain who could have destroyed my career, Washington continued. Instead, she taught me something valuable. She said that real leadership isn't about punishing people for their mistakes. It's about helping them become better than they were. Blake felt a lump in his throat. I don't deserve this chance. Maybe not, Washington agreed. But my daughter deserves to grow up in a world where police officers treat everyone fairly. And you have the opportunity to become the kind of officer who makes that possible. Blake thought about Lily, the little girl in the baseball uniform who had called Washington Dad. He thought about how scared she had looked when she saw her father being confronted by police. I won't let you down, Blake said. Don't make promises you can't keep, Washington warned. This is going to be harder than you think. You're going to face situations that challenge everything you believe about people and communities. Blake stood up, clutching the packet of papers. When do I start? Monday morning, 6 a.m. You'll meet with Reverend James Taylor at the Mount Olive Baptist Church. He runs a community breakfast program for seniors and families in need. Blake wrote down the information. What will I be doing there? Whatever they need you to do, Washington said. Serving food, cleaning tables, listening to people's stories. Learning that the people you patrol aren't statistics or potential threats. They're neighbors. Blake nodded and headed for the door. Officer Rodriguez, Washington called after him. Blake turned back. This isn't just about you anymore, Washington said. Every interaction you have from now on reflects on this department and on me personally. Don't make me regret this decision. Blake left the office feeling like he had been given a tremendous gift and a heavy burden at the same time. As he walked through the station, he noticed other officers looking at him strangely. Word traveled fast in a police department. Officer Torres caught up with him in the parking lot. So what happened? Are you fired? Blake looked at his friend, then at the packet of papers in his hand. No, but I think that might have been the easier option. That evening, Blake sat at his kitchen table reading through the materials Captain Washington had given him. There were articles about implicit bias, statistics about racial profiling, and personal stories from community members who had experienced discrimination. One story particularly struck him. It was written by a father who described being pulled over while driving his daughter to school. The officer had assumed the car was stolen because it was expensive and the driver was black. The man's daughter had watched her father be handcuffed and searched before the officer realized his mistake. Blake thought about Lily Washington, watching her father being confronted in front of the baseball field. He wondered how many other children had similar memories. His girlfriend Lisa came home from her teaching job and found him still reading at the table. Rough day? She asked, kissing the top of his head. Blake told her everything. About the incident the night before, about discovering his new captain's identity, about the choice he had been given. Lisa listened without judgment, which was one of the reasons Blake loved her. I'm proud of you for taking responsibility, she said when he finished. But this is just the beginning. Are you really ready to change? Blake looked at the stack of papers, then at Lisa's kind but serious expression. I have to be. I can't be the kind of cop who scares little kids. Lisa squeezed his shoulder. Then let's get to work. Blake Rodriguez stood outside Mount Olive Baptist Church at 5:55 a.m. on Monday morning, holding a cup of coffee and feeling completely out of place. The neighborhood was different from his usual patrol area. Older houses, smaller yards, and people who looked nothing like the residents of Riverside Heights. Reverend James Taylor opened the church doors exactly at 6 a.m. He was a man in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes that seemed to see right through Blake's nervous exterior. You must be Officer Rodriguez, Reverend Taylor said, extending his hand. Captain Washington told me you'd be joining us. Blake shook the Reverend's hand, surprised by the man's warm smile. Yes, sir. I'm here to help with whatever you need. Well, we can certainly use an extra pair of hands, Reverend Taylor said, leading Blake into the church basement. We serve breakfast to about 100 people every morning. Seniors, families, folks who are having a hard time making ends meet. The basement was already buzzing with activity. Volunteers were setting up tables, preparing food, and arranging chairs. Blake noticed that most of the volunteers were black, and he suddenly felt very aware of his own skin color. Don't worry, Reverend Taylor said, noticing Blake's hesitation. Everyone here is friendly. They might be curious about you at first, but that's natural. Blake was assigned to work with Mrs. Dorothy Williams, a woman in her 70s who had been volunteering at the church for over 20 years. She was small but energetic, with silver hair and a no-nonsense attitude. So you're the police officer who's here to learn about the community, Mrs. Williams said, as she handed Blake an apron. Captain Washington told us about you. Blake felt his face flush. What did he tell you? That you made a mistake and you want to do better? Mrs. Williams replied simply. We all make mistakes, honey. The question is what we do about them. For the next 2 hours, Blake served scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast to a steady stream of people. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly Latina woman who came in every morning after walking her neighbor's dog. There was Tommy, a teenager whose mother worked 2 jobs and couldn't always afford groceries. There was Mr. Johnson, a veteran who lived in a small apartment and came to the church as much for the company as for the food. At first, Blake was quiet, just doing his job and trying not to make eye contact. But Mrs. Williams wouldn't let him hide. Talk to people, she said. They're not going to bite you. Ask them how they're doing. Learn their names. Blake started small. Good morning. How are you today? Became his standard greeting. Gradually, people began to respond with more than just fine. Mrs. Rodriguez told him about her grandson who was starting college in the fall. Tommy mentioned that he was working on getting his GED while helping support his family. Mr. Johnson shared stories about his time in the Army and his struggle to find work after coming home. Blake was surprised to realize that he was actually enjoying himself. These people weren't the threatening figures he had imagined in his mind. They were just people dealing with life's challenges, trying to get by with dignity. After the breakfast service ended, Reverend Taylor asked Blake to help him clean up. How was your first day? The Reverend asked as they wiped down tables. Different than I expected, Blake admitted. Everyone was really nice. What did you expect? Reverend Taylor asked. Blake hesitated. I guess I expected people to be angry with me. Or suspicious. Some might be, Reverend Taylor said. But most people here believe in redemption. They've all needed second chances at some point in their lives. Over the following weeks, Blake settled into a routine. Breakfast service at the church 3 mornings a week, cultural sensitivity training 2 evenings a week, and community meetings on Saturday afternoons. The training sessions were harder than the volunteer work. Blake had to confront uncomfortable truths about his own biases and assumptions. He learned about the history of policing in Black communities, about systemic racism, and about the impact of his actions on families like the Washingtons. During one particularly difficult session, Blake watched a video of young Black men describing their experiences with police. One story after another of being stopped, questioned, and treated as suspects for no reason other than their appearance. Blake recognized himself in some of those officers' actions. The aggressive posture, the assumption of guilt, the failure to see the person behind the skin color. This is hard to watch, Blake admitted to the group facilitator. Dr. Patricia Hayes, it should be, Dr. Hayes replied. Change isn't comfortable. If it was easy, everyone would do it. Blake's real test came 6 weeks into his community service. He was working his regular patrol shift when he got a call about a domestic disturbance on Elm Street, right in the heart of the neighborhood where he volunteered. When Blake arrived at the apartment building, he could hear shouting from the 2nd floor. A small crowd had gathered in the courtyard, including several people he recognized from the church breakfast program. That's Officer Rodriguez, he heard Mrs. Williams say to another woman. He's been helping us at the church. Blake felt the weight of their expectations as he climbed the stairs to apartment 2B. Everything he had learned over the past month and a half would be put to the test. He knocked on the door. Police. Someone called about a disturbance. The shouting stopped. After a moment, a young woman opened the door. Her name was Carmen, and Blake recognized her from the breakfast program. She usually came in with her 2 small children. Officer Rodriguez? Carmen said, surprised. I didn't expect... I know you from the church? Blake could see into the apartment behind her. A man was standing in the living room, his fists clenched. The 2 children Blake knew from the breakfast program were huddled together on the couch, looking scared. In the past, Blake would have immediately assumed the worst about the man. He would have come in with force, ready for a fight. But now he saw a family in crisis, not a crime scene. Carmen, are you and the kids okay? Blake asked quietly. Carmen nodded, though Blake could see she had been crying. It's just... Things are hard right now. Miguel lost his job last week and we're behind on rent. We were arguing about money. Blake looked at Miguel, who was watching him warily. Blake could see the frustration and desperation in the man's eyes. He had seen the same look on faces at the breakfast program. People struggling to maintain their dignity while everything fell apart around them. Miguel, is it? Blake said, stepping into the apartment but keeping his posture relaxed. I'm Officer Rodriguez. I've met your kids at Mount Olive Baptist. They're good kids. Miguel's defensive stance softened slightly. You know my kids? Yeah, they come to breakfast sometimes with their mom. Your daughter always helps serve the other children. She's got a kind heart. Blake spent the next 30 minutes talking with the family, not as a cop responding to a disturbance, but as someone who knew them as people. He learned about Miguel's job search, about Carmen's struggle to balance work and childcare, about the children's fear that they might have to move again. Before he left, Blake gave them information about job placement services and rent assistance programs. He also made sure they knew about the church's food pantry and emergency assistance fund. As Blake walked back to his patrol car, Mrs. Williams approached him from the courtyard. That was well done, she said. You saw a family that needed help, not a problem that needed solving. Blake looked back at the apartment building. A month ago, I would have handled that completely differently. What would you have done? Mrs. Williams asked. Blake thought about it. I would have gone in expecting trouble. I would have seen Miguel as a threat instead of a father who's struggling. I probably would have escalated things instead of calming them down. Mrs. Williams nodded. And what's the difference now? Blake considered the question as he drove back to the station. The difference wasn't just the training or the volunteer work. The difference was that he now knew these people as individuals, not as stereotypes. Carmen wasn't just another call about domestic disturbance. She was someone who made sure other people's children had enough to eat before she fed her own family. Miguel wasn't just another angry man in a poor neighborhood. He was someone who worked construction until his back gave out, who taught his son to play baseball in the courtyard, who read bedtime stories to his daughter every night. That evening, Blake called Captain Washington to report on the incident. How do you think you handled it? Washington asked. Better than I would have before, Blake said honestly, but I still have a lot to learn. That's the most important lesson, Washington replied. The moment you think you know everything is the moment you stop growing. Blake was starting to understand that becoming a better police officer wasn't just about following rules or procedures. It was about seeing the humanity in every person he encountered, regardless of their circumstances or the color of their skin. 6 months had passed since that fateful Tuesday evening when Blake Rodriguez confronted Captain Washington outside Riverside Park. As Blake walked into the police station on a crisp Friday morning, he carried with him a folder containing his completion certificates from cultural sensitivity training, community service verification forms, and letters of recommendation from Reverend Taylor and Mrs. Williams. Blake had requested a meeting with Captain Washington to discuss his progress and his future with the department. Over the past months, their relationship had evolved from that of a disgraced officer and disappointed superior to something resembling mutual respect. Blake knocked on Captain Washington's office door and was invited in. The office looked the same as it had 6 months ago, but Blake felt like a completely different person entering it. Officer Rodriguez, Captain Washington said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I understand you wanted to discuss your community service program. Blake sat down and placed his folder on the desk. Yes, sir. I wanted to thank you first, for giving me a chance to grow instead of just throwing my career away. Washington picked up the folder and began reviewing its contents. These are impressive reports. Blake, Reverend Taylor says you've become one of their most reliable volunteers. Mrs. Williams wrote that you've helped 3 families connect with job placement services. Blake felt a surge of pride, but also humility. It's been the most rewarding work I've ever done. I've learned more about policing in the past 6 months than I did in my first 3 years on the force. Tell me about that, Washington said, leaning back in his chair. Blake had thought about this conversation for weeks. When I first became a cop, I thought my job was to catch bad guys and protect good people. But I never really thought about who decided who was good and who was bad. I was making those decisions based on assumptions and stereotypes. Washington nodded, encouraging Blake to continue. Working in the community, I realized that most people aren't good or bad. They're just people trying to do their best with whatever circumstances they're facing. My job isn't to judge them. It's to serve them. Blake paused, choosing his words carefully. Captain, I want to apologize again for what I did to you that night. Not just because you're my boss, but because you were a father taking equipment to coach his daughter's team. And I turned that into a threatening situation." Washington was quiet for a moment. "Blake, I appreciate that apology. But I want you to understand something. What happened that night wasn't just about me. It was about every black father, every black son, every black mother who has been treated as a threat simply for existing in certain spaces." Blake nodded. "I understand that now, and I want to make sure it never happens again, not just with me, but with other officers too." This caught Washington's attention. "What do you mean?" Blake opened his folder and pulled out a proposal he had been working on for weeks. "I'd like to develop a community policing training program for new recruits, something that goes beyond the standard cultural sensitivity workshops." Washington examined the proposal. Blake had outlined a comprehensive program that would require new officers to spend time in the communities they would patrol, working alongside community leaders and learning about the people they would serve. "This is ambitious," Washington said. "You're talking about a significant change in how we train officers." "I think it's necessary," Blake replied. "Most officers, including me, never really interact with community members except when something has gone wrong. We see people on their worst days, in their worst moments. We never see them as whole human beings." Blake's voice grew more passionate as he continued. "What if new officers had to volunteer at community centers, attend neighborhood meetings, help with youth programs? What if they knew the people they were protecting before they had to police them?" Washington was impressed by the thought Blake had put into the proposal. "You've really considered this carefully." "Captain, I've been thinking about this every day for 6 months. Every time I serve breakfast at the church, every time I help a family navigate social services, every time I see officers interacting with community members, I think about how we could do better." Washington set the proposal aside. "Blake, I have a confession to make. I've been watching your progress very closely, not just through your reports, but through my own conversations with community leaders." Blake looked surprised. "Reverend Taylor told me about how you handled the situation with the Rodriguez family. Mrs. Williams mentioned that you've started organizing a youth basketball league. Carmen Rodriguez called the department to specifically thank you for your help." Blake felt overwhelmed. He hadn't realized that his work was being noticed by so many people. "The truth is," Washington continued, "I had already decided to ask you to help develop training programs for our department. Your proposal just confirms that we're thinking along the same lines." Blake couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You want me to train other officers?" "I want you to share what you've learned," Washington clarified. "Not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has been through the process of real change." Blake thought about his fellow officers, some of whom had been supportive of his community work and others who had been skeptical or even hostile. "Captain, some of the other officers think what I'm doing is unnecessary. They think I'm being punished or that I'm trying to make them look bad." Washington nodded. "Change is always met with resistance, but you know what I've noticed? The officers who are most resistant to community policing training are often the ones who need it most." Blake understood exactly what Washington meant. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," Washington said. "The City Council has approved funding for a new community liaison position. Someone who would work directly with neighborhood organizations, attend community meetings, and serve as a bridge between the police department and the residents we serve." Blake's heart started racing. "Are you offering me the position?" "I'm offering you the opportunity to apply for it," Washington said. "But I think you'd be perfect for it. You understand both sides now. You know what it's like to make assumptions and how to overcome them." Blake thought about his girlfriend Lisa, who had been so supportive throughout his transformation. He thought about Mrs. Williams, who had become like a grandmother to him. He thought about the children at the church who now ran up to hug him when they saw him. "I'm interested," Blake said. "But I have one condition." Washington raised an eyebrow. "You're in no position to make conditions, Officer Rodriguez." Blake smiled. "I want to continue my regular patrol duties too. I don't want to become just an administrator. I want to stay connected to the street-level work." Washington considered this. "That would mean longer hours, more responsibility." "I know," Blake said, "but I think the best community liaisons are the ones who are still actively policing. It keeps you grounded in the reality of the job." Washington extended his hand across the desk. "I think we have a deal," as Blake shook his captain's hand. He thought about how different this moment was from their first meeting in this office 6 months ago. "Captain, can I ask you something personal?" Blake said. "Go ahead. How is Lily doing?" "Your daughter? I think about her sometimes, about how scared she looked that night." Washington's expression softened. "She's doing well. She asks about you sometimes, actually. She remembers the officer who learned how to be better." Blake felt tears in his eyes. "I hope I can be the kind of officer she can trust." "You already are," Washington said. "The Blake Rodriguez who confronted me that night would never have thought to ask about my daughter's well-being. The Blake Rodriguez sitting here now put her needs before his own pride." 3 weeks later, Blake found himself back at Riverside Park for a community meeting about the new policing initiatives. The same park where everything had started, where he had made the biggest mistake of his career. As he set up chairs for the meeting, Blake noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was David Washington, but he wasn't in uniform. He was wearing jeans and a baseball cap, carrying his daughter's pink bat. "Officer Rodriguez," Washington called out with a smile. "Fancy meeting you here," Blake laughed. "Just Blake is fine, Captain. Are you here for the meeting?" "Actually, I'm here for practice," Washington said, pointing toward the baseball field. "Lily's team has a game tomorrow, but I wanted to stop by and see how the community meeting goes." Blake looked toward the field where a group of 8-year-old girls were warming up. He spotted Lily in her purple and yellow uniform practicing her swing. "She's gotten taller," Blake observed. "Kids do that," Washington said. "She's also gotten braver. She wants to be a police officer when she grows up." Blake was stunned. "Really? She says she wants to help people the way Officer Blake helped the Rodriguez family," Washington explained. "You've become something of a hero to her." Blake felt the full weight of his transformation in that moment. 6 months ago, he had been the kind of officer that parents warned their children about. Now, he was the kind of officer that children wanted to become. As community members began arriving for the meeting, Blake saw familiar faces from the church, from his patrols, from his new life as a community-focused police officer. Mrs. Williams gave him a warm hug. Reverend Taylor introduced him to new volunteers. Carmen Rodriguez brought her children to meet the officer who had helped their family. Blake looked around at the gathering crowd, at Captain Washington heading toward the baseball field, at the park where his old life had ended and his new life had begun. He thought about the choice Washington had given him 6 months ago. The choice between punishment and growth, between staying the same and becoming better. Blake realized that the most important changes in life often came disguised as the worst moments. That Tuesday evening when he confronted an innocent man with a baseball bat had felt like the end of everything. In reality, it had been the beginning of the person he was always meant to become.